The dust devil spun across the New Mexico territory like a devil's breath, and it was in that moment of watching the whirlwind dance toward the horizon that Kyle Newman saw her collapse beside his well, her body hitting the hard earth with a sound that echoed through the emptiness of his ranch like a gunshot. He dropped the bucket he had been carrying and ran, his boots pounding against the sun-baked ground as he covered the distance between the barn and the well in seconds. She lay face down, her dark hair spread around her head like spilled ink, her clothing torn and dusty, her feet wrapped in what remained of deteriorating moccasins. Even before he reached her, he could see the rise and fall of her breathing, shallow but present, and relief flooded through him. Kyle knelt beside her and gently turned her over, his calloused hands surprisingly tender as he cradled her head. Her face was beautiful despite the grime and exhaustion etched into her features, her Apache heritage evident in the strong lines of her cheekbones and the darkness of her skin. She could not have been much older than 20, he guessed, and he wondered what terrible circumstances had brought her to his isolated ranch 15 miles outside of Tahlequah, Arizona territory, in this scorching July of 1881. He checked her pulse at her throat and found it thready but steady. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, her skin hot to the touch with what he suspected was a combination of fever and sunstroke. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms and carried her toward his small adobe house, surprised at how light she felt, how fragile despite the obvious strength in her frame. The interior of his home offered blessed relief from the afternoon heat, the thick walls keeping the rooms relatively cool. He had built this house himself 3 years ago when he had first staked his claim on this land, determined to make something of himself after the war had taken everything from him back in Kansas. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with 2 smaller rooms branching off for sleeping quarters and storage. Kyle carried her to his own bedroom, laying her carefully on the simple bed with its rough cotton sheets. He fetched water from the barrel he kept inside, along with clean cloths, and began the process of trying to bring down her fever and get some moisture into her body. For the first hour he worked methodically, wiping her face and arms with cool water, dribbling tiny amounts between her lips, checking her breathing. She never stirred, lost somewhere deep in unconsciousness. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Kyle noticed the wounds on her body, scrapes and cuts that spoke of a hard journey through rough terrain, blisters on her feet that had burst and become infected. He cleaned each wound with the whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes, his jaw tight as he imagined what she must have endured. There were old scars too, marks that told stories he could only guess at. When he finished, he covered her with a light blanket and sat back in the wooden chair beside the bed, studying her face in the golden light filtering through the single window. Kyle had seen Apache women before, of course. The territory was home to several tribes, though tensions between the settlers and the native peoples ran high. The government had been pushing the Apache onto reservations for years now, often with brutal force, and Kyle had witnessed enough injustice to make him sick. He had no love for the policies that treated human beings like cattle to be herded and contained. He did not know her story, but he knew he would not turn her away. Whatever she was running from or running toward, she would be safe here until she chose to leave. The first night passed slowly. Kyle dozed in the chair, waking every hour to check on her condition. Her fever remained high, and twice she began to shake with chills despite the warm night air. Each time, he added another blanket and bathed her face with cool water, speaking softly to her in case some part of her could hear him. "You are safe here," he told her in the pre-dawn darkness. "Whatever you need, I will help you, just hold on." The second day brought no change. Her breathing remained shallow, her fever persistent. Kyle forced water between her lips drop by drop, grateful when her throat reflexively swallowed. He prepared a thin broth from the dried beef and vegetables in his pantry, managing to get a few spoonfuls into her by midday. His ranch work went largely neglected. He had only 6 horses and a dozen cattle, manageable enough that missing a day or two would not spell disaster, but he could not bring himself to leave her side for more than a few minutes at a time. Something about her presence had awakened a protective instinct in him that he had thought long dead. Kyle Newman was 26 years old and had been alone for most of his adult life. The war had taken his father and older brother, leaving him to care for his mother until she passed from illness 2 years after the fighting ended. He had sold their small farm in Kansas and headed west, seeking a fresh start in a land where the past did not cling to every corner. He had found peace in the solitude of the New Mexico territory, in the hard work of building something with his own hands. But as he sat beside this dying woman, he realized how much loneliness had become his constant companion. The nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, and he went weeks sometimes without seeing another human face. On the third day, as the sun climbed toward noon and heat shimmered off the desert floor visible through his window, Kyle found himself talking to her more, telling her about his life, his dreams for the ranch, the hawk he had seen that morning circling over the well. "I think you will wake up today," he said, wringing out a cloth in the basin of water. "I do not know why, but I feel it. You have been fighting hard these 3 days. I can see it in the way you breathe, the way your hands clench sometimes like you are battling demons I cannot see." He wiped her face gently, noting with satisfaction that her fever seemed to have finally broken. Her skin felt cooler, more natural. "When you wake up, I hope you will not be afraid. I know you have no reason to trust me, a white man on stolen land, but I promise you I mean you no harm." It was early afternoon when her eyes finally opened. Kyle had stepped away briefly to fetch fresh water from the barrel in the kitchen. When he returned, he found her staring at the ceiling, her dark eyes wide and confused. He froze in the doorway, not wanting to startle her. "Hello," he said softly. Her head turned toward him with visible effort, and he saw the moment awareness flooded back into her eyes. Fear followed quickly, and she tried to push herself up, her body trembling with the effort. "Please, do not try to move yet," Kyle said, setting down the water pitcher and holding up his hands to show he meant no threat. "You have been very sick. You collapsed 3 days ago by my well." She stared at him, her breathing rapid, her body tense as a bowstring ready to snap. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Kyle picked up the cup of water from the bedside table and approached slowly, as one might approach a frightened animal. "You need to drink," he said, kneeling beside the bed to bring himself to her eye level. "Please, just water, nothing more." She watched him with those intense dark eyes, and he could see her mind working, assessing the situation, calculating risks. Finally, she gave the smallest of nods. Kyle helped her sit up slightly, supporting her shoulders with one arm while he brought the cup to her lips with the other. She drank greedily, and he had to pull it away after a few swallows. "Slowly," he cautioned. "Too much at once will make you sick." After a moment, he let her drink more. When she had finished the cup, he eased her back down against the pillow. She looked even more exhausted from just that small effort, but her eyes never left his face. "My name is Kyle Newman," he told her. "This is my ranch. You are safe here. Do you understand?" She nodded again, very slightly. "Can you tell me your name?" Her lips parted, and this time a sound emerged, rough and barely audible. "Halona. Halona," he repeated, and something in his chest tightened at the sound of it. "That is a beautiful name. Can you tell me what happened to you, how you came to be here?" She closed her eyes, and for a moment he thought she had slipped back into unconsciousness. But then she spoke, her voice gaining a bit more strength, though it remained little more than a whisper. "Running," she said. "Was running." "From what, soldiers?" "They came to our camp. We were not on reservation land, but we had permission, papers from the Indian agent. They did not care. They burned everything." Her eyes opened again, and he saw tears gathering at the corners. "My family, they scattered. I ran. I just ran." Kyle felt a cold anger settle in his gut. He had heard stories of such raids, authorized and unauthorized both. The Apache had been fighting a losing battle for their homeland for decades, and the government's solution was to round them up and confine them, often with little regard for treaties or agreements. "How long were you running?" "I do not know. Days. I ran out of water, lost my horse in a canyon, kept walking." She swallowed hard. "I saw your well. I thought if I could just reach it, just get water, but then everything went dark." "You nearly died," Kyle said bluntly. "Another few hours in that sun without water and you would have. Your feet are badly infected. You had a high fever for 3 days." She absorbed this information silently, then asked, "Why did you help me? Why not just leave me to die or turn me over to the soldiers?" "Because that would make me no better than the men who destroyed your camp," Kyle said simply. "And because it is the right thing to do. You are welcome to stay here as long as you need to heal. When you are ready to leave, I will help you however I can. But you are under no obligation to go. This offer has no conditions." Halona studied him for a long moment, and Kyle felt the weight of that gaze, felt as though she were looking directly into his soul and measuring what she found there. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because some of the tension left her body. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I do not know if I can trust you yet, but thank you for my life." "That is fair," Kyle acknowledged. "Trust is earned, not given. For now, you need to rest and heal. Are you hungry?" She nodded, and he saw the hunger in her eyes even as she tried to hide it. He wondered when she had last eaten a proper meal. "I will bring you some broth to start. Your stomach needs to wake up gently. Tomorrow, if you keep that down, we can try something more substantial." Over the following days, a routine developed. Kyle would wake at dawn and check on Halona first thing, bringing her water and whatever food he deemed appropriate for her recovery. He would then attend to his morning chores, feeding the horses and cattle, checking the well and the fences. By mid-morning, he would return to the house to prepare a more substantial meal for both of them, which he would bring to her room on a tray. At first, Halona ate in silence, wary and watchful. But as her strength returned and Kyle proved consistent in his gentle treatment of her, she began to talk more. She told him about her people, a small band of Kairikahua Apache who had been trying to live peacefully on land they had been promised. Her father had been a respected leader, her mother a skilled healer. She had 2 younger brothers and a sister, all of whom she had last seen running in different directions as the soldiers descended on their camp. "I do not know if they survived," she said one afternoon, her voice thick with grief. "I keep telling myself they must have. My brothers are fast, clever. My sister knows how to hide, but I do not know." Kyle sat in his usual chair beside the bed, his heart aching for her loss. "When you are well enough, we can try to find out. I can make inquiries carefully. There are people who might know what happened to the others from your camp." "You would do that?" She looked at him with surprise. "Of course. They are your family." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You are not like other white men I have met." "I am just a man trying to do right by my conscience," Kyle said. "I have seen enough cruelty in my life. I have no desire to add to it." "You were a soldier," she said, and it was not a question. "I have seen the way you move, the way you assess everything. You fought in the war between the states." "I did," he admitted. "Not by choice. I was barely 17 when my father and brother volunteered. My mother begged them not to go, but they felt it was their duty. They both died at Gettysburg. A year later, I was conscripted. I survived, but I left something of myself on those battlefields. I do not have the stomach for violence anymore. Yet you know how to fight. Knowing and wanting are different things. Halona nodded slowly. Among my people, the warriors who had seen enough death and wanted no more were honored. They became teachers, advisors. There is no shame in choosing peace. Your people are wise. By the end of the first week, Halona was strong enough to sit up in bed without assistance and to feed herself. Kyle had been treating the infections on her feet with poultices made from herbs he grew in his small garden. And though the healing was slow, it was steady. He could see her frustration at her weakness, at her dependence on him, but she bore it with a quiet dignity that he found himself admiring more each day. He was also becoming acutely aware of her presence in his home in ways that had nothing to do with her need for care. The sound of her voice had become something he looked forward to, the rare moments when she smiled, lighting up his simple house in a way the sun never could. He found himself taking more care with his appearance, washing more frequently, trimming his beard more often. It was dangerous, this growing attachment. He knew that. She was Apache, he was white. The world outside his ranch would not look kindly on any connection between them. But in the quiet isolation of his home, with only the desert and the sky as witnesses, Kyle found it increasingly difficult to care what the world thought. One evening, as he brought her dinner, Halona asked, "May I see the rest of your house? I am tired of these four walls." "Do you feel strong enough to walk?" "I think so. With help." Kyle set down the tray and offered her his arm. She pushed back the blanket and swung her bandaged feet to the floor, wincing slightly as she put weight on them. But she did not complain, only gripped his arm firmly as he helped her stand. They moved slowly into the main room, and Kyle felt absurdly proud of his humble home as she looked around with clear interest. He had built most of the furniture himself, simple but sturdy pieces that served their purposes well. The fireplace dominated one wall, with his limited cooking equipment arranged nearby. A small table with two chairs sat beneath the window, and a single bookshelf held his precious collection of a dozen volumes, survivors of his previous life. "You have books," Halona said, surprise evident in her voice. "I do. Do you read?" "Yes. Missionaries came to our camp when I was young. They taught us to read English, hoping to convert us. We learned the reading but kept our own beliefs." She smiled slightly. "They were not pleased," Kyle laughed. "I imagine not. You are welcome to any of the books. They could use some appreciation. I have read each one so many times I practically have them memorized." "I would like that. Thank you." They continued the slow circuit of the room, Halona leaning heavily on his arm but determined to see everything. When they reached the window, she paused, looking out at the desert landscape painted gold and crimson by the setting sun. "It is beautiful here," she said softly. "Lonely, but beautiful." "It is," Kyle agreed, though he was not looking at the view. He was watching the way the sunset light caught in her dark hair, the strong profile of her face, the gentle curve of her lips. "Though it has been less lonely lately." She turned to look at him, and their eyes met. For a moment neither spoke. The air between them seemed to crackle with something unspoken, something Kyle was not quite ready to name. Then Halona swayed slightly, fatigue catching up with her, and the moment passed. "You should rest," Kyle said, steadying her. "We can do this again tomorrow." "Yes," she agreed, but there was a new awareness in her eyes, a recognition that something between them had shifted. As the days turned into weeks, Halona grew stronger. Soon she was able to move around the house on her own, and she insisted on helping with tasks despite Kyle's protests that she should focus on healing. "I am not an invalid," she told him firmly, "and I do not like being idle. Let me help." So they fell into a partnership of sorts. Halona could not yet manage much walking, but she could sit at the table and prepare vegetables for cooking, mend his worn clothing, organize his chaotic pantry. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they would sit together, and she would read aloud from his books, her voice giving new life to stories he thought he knew by heart. Kyle found himself telling her things he had never spoken aloud before. About his childhood in Kansas, about the farm his family had worked for generations, about his father's stern kindness and his mother's gentle wisdom, about his brother who had been his best friend, and how the news of their deaths had arrived within hours of each other, shattering his mother's heart. "She never recovered," he said one night as they sat at the table, the remnants of dinner between them. "She lived for 2 more years, but it was like something vital had been cut out of her. She went through the motions of life, but she was not really there anymore. When she finally passed, I felt guilty for the relief I felt. She was finally at peace." "Grief is complicated," Halona said, reaching across the table to touch his hand briefly. "You do not need to feel guilty for feeling relief that her suffering ended. That is not the same as wishing her gone." The touch of her hand sent warmth radiating up his arm, and Kyle had to resist the urge to capture her fingers and hold on. Instead, he nodded and said, "Thank you for understanding." "I know something of grief myself," she reminded him gently. "The not knowing about my family is its own kind of death. Every day I wonder if they are alive, if they think of me, if they believe I abandoned them." "You did not abandon them. You survived. That is all any of them would want for you. I hope so, but hope and knowing are different things." That night, lying in his bedroll in the storage room he had converted into makeshift sleeping quarters so Halona could have his bedroom, Kyle stared at the ceiling and admitted to himself what he had been trying to deny for weeks. He was falling in love with her. It was foolish and complicated and probably doomed from the start, but he could not help it. Everything about her drew him in. Her strength and resilience, the way she faced each day despite the trauma she had endured. Her intelligence and wit, revealed more each day as she grew comfortable with him. The way she moved, graceful even with her injuries. The sound of her laughter, rare but precious when he managed to coax it out. But more than any of that, it was the sense of rightness he felt when she was near. As though something in him that had been incomplete had finally found its missing piece. He had not believed in such things before, had thought them the fancy of poets and dreamers. But he believed now. The question was what to do about it. He could not simply declare his feelings. She was still healing, still vulnerable, still dependent on his hospitality. Any declaration now might seem like pressure, like he expected something in return for his help. And beyond that, there was the harsh reality of the world they lived in. A white man and an Apache woman could not simply decide to be together without consequences. Still, as sleep finally claimed him, Kyle allowed himself to dream of possibilities. Halona had her own revelations to contend with. As she grew stronger and spent more time in Kyle's company, she found herself watching him with increasing interest. She noticed the way his hands moved, confident and capable whether he was working with tools or cooking a meal. She noticed the kindness in his gray-green eyes, the way he always seemed to be thinking of her comfort and well-being. She noticed the sound of his voice, deep and steady, and the way it made her feel safe. It had been a long time since she had felt safe. She had been raised to be wary of white men, and with good reason. The Apache had been fighting for their survival against encroachment for her entire life. She had seen friends killed, relatives rounded up and sent away, families torn apart. She had every reason to hate Kyle simply for the color of his skin, but she could not. He had saved her life, yes, but it was more than that. He had treated her with respect from the moment she woke in his bed. He had never made her feel like a burden or a prisoner. He spoke to her as an equal, listened to her stories, valued her opinions. He had made space for her in his life without demanding anything in return. And somewhere in the past weeks, he had made space for himself in her heart. It was terrifying. She had thought she might never see her family again, might spend the rest of her life running and hiding. The idea of opening herself to caring for someone, to the possibility of more loss, made her want to flee back into the desert. But when she looked at Kyle, when she saw the way he tried to hide his feelings for her and failed, something in her chest would tighten with an emotion that felt dangerously like hope. One morning in early August, nearly 6 weeks after Halona had first collapsed at his well, Kyle announced that he needed to ride into Tahlequah for supplies. "I have been putting it off, but I cannot delay any longer," he said over breakfast. "I am out of flour and coffee and the horses need new shoes. It will take most of the day, but I should be back by evening." Halona felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of him leaving. "What if someone followed you here? What if they find me? No one knows you are here." "I have seen no one since the day you arrived, and the house cannot be seen from the main road. You will be safe. But if it would make you feel better, you can hide in the storage room. I can move some boxes to create a concealed space, just in case." "Yes," she said, hating the fear in her voice but unable to deny its presence. "That would help." Kyle spent the next hour creating a hiding place for her, moving supplies to create a small alcove at the back of the storage room that could be concealed behind stacked boxes and barrels. He showed her how to slip into the space and how to pull the last box into position behind her to complete the concealment. "I know it is uncomfortable," he said, helping her back out. "But if anyone came looking, they would have to know exactly where to look to find you." "It is good," Halona assured him. "Thank you." Before he left, Kyle did something he had never done before. He reached out and took both of her hands in his, looking down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I will come back," he said quietly. "I promise you, Halona. I will always come back." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched from the window as he saddled his horse and rode away toward the east. The house felt emptier than it ever had before, and she found herself touching her hands where his had held them, still feeling the warmth of his touch. Kyle made the ride to Tahlequah as quickly as he could without exhausting his horse. The town was small but growing, serving as a trading hub for the scattered ranches and mines in the area. He knew most of the merchants by sight if not by name, and he moved through his errands efficiently. At the general store, while the owner was gathering his supplies, Kyle overheard a conversation between two men that made his blood run cold. "Heard they are still looking for survivors from that Apache camp they raided last month," one man was saying. "Lost one woman in particular. Daughter of some chief or important man. Army wants her found." "Why bother?" the other man replied. "She is probably dead by now, out in the desert. Maybe, but the orders came from high up. They think she might be trying to reach other Apache, coordinate some kind of resistance." Ridiculous if you ask me, but they are offering a reward for information. Kyle kept his expression neutral as he paid for his supplies, but his mind was racing. They were looking for Halona, actively looking. The situation was more dangerous than he had realized. He gathered the rest of his purchases quickly and started the ride home, pushing his horse harder than he should have. The sun was still high when he arrived back at the ranch, and he felt a wave of relief when he entered the house and called out Halona's name. She emerged from the storage room, her face lighting up when she saw him. "You are back early. Did something happen?" "We need to talk," Kyle said, and proceeded to tell her what he had overheard. Halona listened with growing alarm, her hands clenched together. "My father," she said when he finished. "They must think I am going to try to find him, to warn him of something. Or maybe they want to use me to draw him out. Where is your father?" "I do not know. He was trying to negotiate with the Indian agent when the soldiers came. He may have been arrested or he may have escaped. If he is free, he will be hiding, moving constantly." She looked up at Kyle with fear in her eyes. "If they find me here, they will arrest you for harboring me. You could go to prison or worse." "I do not care about that. You should." "Kyle, I cannot let you risk everything for me. Maybe I should leave, head deeper into the territory where they cannot find me." "You are not well enough for that kind of journey," Kyle said firmly. "And I am not letting you go out there alone. We will figure something out." "What can we figure out?" "I am a wanted woman. As long as I am here, you are in danger." Kyle moved closer to her, and before he could second-guess himself, he took her hands just as he had done that morning. "Halona, I need to tell you something. I need you to know before we make any decisions about what happens next." She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide. "What is it?" "I am in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, simple and irrevocable. Kyle saw shock flash across Halona's face, followed by something that looked like joy before fear clouded her expression again. "Kyle, you cannot." "We cannot. The world will not allow it." "I do not care what the world allows. I care what is in my heart, and my heart belongs to you. It has for weeks now, maybe from the moment I saw you lying in the dust and felt my world tilt on its axis." He squeezed her hands gently. "I am not asking you to feel the same way. I am not asking you for anything. I just needed you to know. Whatever we decide to do about the danger you are in, I needed you to know that I love you and I will do whatever it takes to keep you safe." Halona's eyes filled with tears, and one spilled over to track down her cheek. "You foolish man," she whispered. "Do you not know that I love you too? How could I not when you have been nothing but kind and good and patient, when you look at me like I am something precious? When you saved my life and asked for nothing in return," Kyle felt his heart leap in his chest. "You love me." "Yes. God help me, yes. I tried not to. I tried to keep my distance, to remember all the reasons why this is impossible. But I love you, Kyle Newman. And that terrifies me because now there is even more to lose." Kyle pulled her into his arms, and she came willingly, pressing her face against his chest as he held her close. She fit perfectly there, as he had known she would, and he rested his chin on the top of her head. "Then we will face this together," he said. "Whatever comes, we face it together. I am not losing you now that I have found you." They stood like that for a long moment, drawing strength from each other. Then Halona pulled back just enough to look up at him. "What do we do?" "I have an idea," Kyle said slowly. "It is risky and you might hate it, but hear me out." Over the next hour they sat at the table while Kyle outlined his plan. It was indeed risky, but as they talked through the details, Halona had to admit it might work. It was certainly better than her trying to disappear into the desert alone. "We would need to leave here," Kyle said. "The ranch, everything. Start over somewhere new, somewhere we are not known. You would give up your home for me. This is just land and buildings. You are my home now." He reached across the table and took her hand. "But I need to know that this is what you want, not just safety, but this, us, a life together." Halona squeezed his hand, her decision already made. "Yes, that is what I want, more than I have ever wanted anything." That night they made their plans. Kyle would need to sell the ranch and the livestock, which would take time to arrange properly. In the meantime, Halona would remain hidden at the house. Once they had the money from the sale, they would head west to California, to one of the growing cities where they could disappear into the crowd and start fresh. It would not be easy. They would face prejudice and difficulty. But together, they believed they could build a life. As they finalized the details, sitting close together at the table with plans and possibilities spread between them, Kyle felt a contentment he had not known in years. Maybe never. For the first time since before the war, he had something to look forward to, something worth fighting for. "There is one more thing," he said as the night grew late. "I want to do this right. I want to marry you before we leave if you will have me. I do not care if it is not recognized by the government or by society. I want to stand before whatever authority we can find and pledge myself to you properly." Halona smiled, the expression transforming her face with joy. "Yes, I will marry you, Kyle Newman, gladly and without reservation." He leaned across the table and kissed her then, their first kiss, gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "I should probably court you properly first," Kyle said with a slight laugh. "Take you to dinners, bring you flowers." "You have been courting me for weeks without realizing it," Halona replied. "Every meal you cooked, every story you shared, every moment of patience and care. You have already won my heart, but I will take the flowers anyway." The next morning, Kyle rode out early to speak with his nearest neighbor, a rancher named Thomas Mills, who owned a larger spread 10 miles to the south. Mills was a fair man, and Kyle hoped he might be interested in purchasing the Newman ranch rather than going through the longer process of finding a buyer from town. Kyle found Mills supervising repairs on one of his barns, and the older man greeted him warmly. They chatted for a few minutes about weather and cattle before Kyle broached the subject of selling his land. "Selling?" Mills looked surprised. "You have been working that place hard for 3 years, Newman, getting it into good shape. Why would you want to sell now?" "Personal reasons," Kyle said carefully. "I need to relocate west, and I need to do it fairly soon. Your land borders mine on 2 sides. I thought you might be interested in expanding." Mills studied him thoughtfully. "This sudden departure would not have anything to do with that Apache woman the Army is looking for, would it?" Kyle felt his stomach drop, but he kept his expression neutral. "I do not know what you mean." "Come now, Newman. I am not a fool and I am not a gossip. About 6 weeks ago, there was a raid on an Apache camp. A week later, I rode past your place and noticed your horse had not moved from the hitching post for 3 days straight. A man who is working his ranch does not leave his horse saddled that long. Made me wonder what was keeping you inside." Kyle said nothing, trying to calculate the danger. Mills could turn him in, collect whatever reward was being offered, but Mills surprised him. "I also noticed that the soldiers who conducted that raid were not regular Army. They were a unit known for being particularly brutal, led by a captain who enjoys the violence of his work a bit too much. I have no love for such men, regardless of who their targets are." He crossed his arms. "So if you happen to have helped someone escape such men, I would say you did a decent thing, and I would not mention it to anyone." Kyle felt relief flood through him. "Thank you. As for your land, I am interested. Not sure I can match what it is worth on the open market, but I can give you a fair price and I can do it quickly." "How soon do you need the money?" "As soon as possible." They spent the next hour negotiating, and by the time Kyle rode away, he had an agreement. Mills would bring the money in 3 days, along with the paperwork to transfer the deed. It was less than Kyle had hoped to get, but it was enough, and the speed of the transaction was worth the loss. When he returned home and told Halona the news, she threw her arms around him in relief. 3 days. We can last 3 days. "We can," Kyle agreed. "And then we start our new life." Those 3 days were both the longest and shortest of Kyle's life, Every sound made him tense, expecting soldiers to appear at his door. But he forced himself to maintain his normal routines, not wanting to draw attention by acting strangely. In the evenings, he and Halona would sit together, planning their future. She told him about California, where she had heard there were cities large enough that people from many backgrounds lived together. They talked about what kind of work they might find, where they might settle. And they talked about the family they wanted to build together, children who would inherit her strength and his determination, who would grow up knowing both their heritages. "I want to find my family first," Halona said. "Even if we cannot stay with them, I need to know they are alive. I need them to know I am alive." "We will find them," Kyle promised, "however long it takes." On the evening of the second day, as they prepared dinner together in the easy partnership they had developed, Kyle asked her about Apache marriage customs. "I want to honor your traditions," he said. "When we marry, I want it to mean something in your culture as well as in mine." Halona smiled, touched by his consideration. "Among my people, marriage is both simple and complex. The families must agree to the union, and there are exchanges of gifts, ceremonies that can last days. But at its heart, marriage is about two people choosing to build a life together, to support and respect each other. The ceremony is important, but the daily living of those promises is what matters most." "Then we are already halfway there," Kyle said. "I have been supporting and respecting you. Now we just need to make the promises official. When we reach California, we should be able to find a priest or judge willing to marry us," Halona said. "And perhaps, someday when it is safer, we can have an Apache ceremony as well. If we find my father, he would want to bless our union properly." "I would like that," Kyle said. "I would like to meet your father to ask for his blessing even if the marriage has already happened." That night, lying in his bedroll for one of the last times in this house, Kyle thought about the strange path his life had taken. 6 weeks ago, he had been alone, resigned to a solitary existence. Now he was preparing to leave everything behind for love, and he felt no regret, only anticipation. Mills arrived right on schedule the afternoon of the third day, riding up with his son and a strongbox. Kyle met them outside, and they completed the transaction quickly. Mills handed over the money, mostly in gold coin and bills, and Kyle signed over the deed. "I hope you find what you are looking for out west," Mills said as they shook hands. "And Newman. When the soldiers come asking, because they will eventually, I will tell them you sold up and left. But I will not tell them which direction you went or why. That much I can do. I appreciate it more than you know." After Mills and his son departed, Kyle brought the strongbox inside. Halona was waiting, her few belongings already packed in a small bundle. Kyle had his own packing to do, but he had been ruthless in deciding what to take. They would be traveling light and fast. "We should leave tonight," he said. "No point waiting until morning and risking someone else stopping by." Halona nodded, though he could see the nervousness in her eyes. "I am ready." They spent the next few hours packing Kyle's horse and the second mount he kept for emergencies, distributing the weight carefully. Kyle took his most essential tools, a few changes of clothes, his weapons, and his books. Everything else was left behind. As the sun set, they mounted up. Kyle took one last look at the house he had built with his own hands, the ranch he had carved out of the desert. He felt a pang of loss, but when he looked at Halona sitting atop her horse, her face turned toward the west and the future, the pang faded. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she confirmed. They rode out as the stars began to appear, heading west into the darkening sky. The first night, they traveled until the moon rose high overhead, wanting to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the ranch. They made camp in a small canyon, taking turns keeping watch though they saw no signs of pursuit. Over the following days, they fell into a rhythm of travel. They moved during the cooler hours of morning and evening, resting during the heat of the day in whatever shade they could find. Kyle was impressed by Halona's riding skill and her knowledge of how to move through the desert. She showed him which plants held water, which cacti could be eaten, how to find game trails. "You are teaching me to survive in your world," he said one evening as they made camp. "It is our world now," she corrected gently. "Yours and mine together." They had been traveling for nearly 2 weeks, making steady progress westward across New Mexico territory, when they encountered the Apache hunting party. Kyle and Halona had stopped in a small canyon to water the horses at a spring, and they emerged suddenly from the rocks, 4 warriors with rifles and bows. Kyle immediately raised his hands, showing he was no threat, and stepped slightly in front of Halona. "Wait," Halona said, her voice urgent. She spoke quickly in Apache, words Kyle did not understand. One of the warriors responded, his tone suspicious, but he lowered his rifle slightly. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Halona doing most of the talking. Kyle watched the warriors' faces, trying to gauge the danger. They were clearly skeptical, but they were listening. Finally, Halona turned to Kyle. "They know my father. They are part of his band. Kyle, he is alive. He is camped 2 days south of here." Kyle felt a surge of joy for her, seeing the tears of relief streaming down her face. But he was also aware that the situation remained delicate. "What do they want us to do?" "They will take us to him. But Kyle, you should know that my father may not react well to seeing me with a white man. These warriors have already expressed their doubts about you." "I understand. But I am not leaving you, and I am not letting you go alone." "I know." She smiled at him, fierce and proud. "That is why I love you." The journey to the Apache camp took 2 days, as Halona had said. The warriors led them through terrain that Kyle would have thought impassable, along narrow trails and through hidden canyons. It was clear they had chosen this location precisely because it was so difficult to access. The camp itself was small, perhaps 20 people, a mix of warriors, women, and children. They looked up warily as the group approached, and Kyle felt the weight of their stares. He was acutely aware that he was likely the only white man to see this camp alive, and that his continued survival depended entirely on Halona's ability to vouch for him. A man emerged from one of the shelters, and Kyle knew immediately that this was Halona's father. He had the same strong features, the same intelligent eyes. He also had the bearing of a leader, someone accustomed to command and respect. Halona slid from her horse and ran to him, and Kyle watched as father and daughter embraced, both of them speaking rapidly in Apache. The older man held her tightly, and Kyle could see him trembling with emotion. After a long moment, Halona pulled back and turned to Kyle, gesturing him forward. Kyle dismounted and approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. Halona began to speak, clearly telling her father the story of what had happened. Kyle heard his name several times, and he saw the older man's eyes studying him carefully throughout the recitation. When Halona finished, her father spoke, his tone serious. Halona translated for Kyle. "He asks why a white man would risk so much for an Apache woman he did not know. Tell him I did it because it was right. Tell him I could not leave another human being to die when I had the means to help. And tell him that I stayed because his daughter is the most remarkable woman I have ever met, and I fell in love with her." Halona translated, and Kyle saw surprise flicker across her father's face. The older man studied Kyle for a long moment, then spoke again. "He says you speak with a direct tongue, which is good. He asks what your intentions are toward me now. He wants to know if you seek to take me away from my people." Kyle had prepared for this question. Tell him that I want to marry his daughter with his blessing if he will give it. Tell him that we plan to travel to California to start a new life, because she cannot stay in this territory safely. But tell him that she loves her family, and we will return to visit whenever it is safe to do so. I am not taking her away. I am standing beside her as she chooses her own path. The translation took longer this time, and Kyle saw Halona's father's expression soften slightly. He asked another question. He asks what you will do when people hate you for being married to an Apache woman. How will you protect me from their hatred? Tell him I will protect her with my life if necessary. I have fought in war and I am not afraid of prejudice. We will find a place where we can live in peace, and if such a place does not exist, we will create it together. This time, when Halona finished translating, her father actually smiled. He spoke at length, and Halona's face lit up with joy as she listened. When he finished, she turned to Kyle with tears in her eyes. He says you may marry me. He says that he sees the way we look at each other, and he knows that love like that cannot be prevented by anything so small as the color of skin or the history between our peoples. He says that if you are willing to face the world's hatred to stand beside me, then you have his respect and his blessing. Kyle felt relief and happiness flood through him. He bowed his head to Halona's father respectfully. Thank you. I swear to you that I will do everything in my power to make her happy and keep her safe. Halona's father, whose name was Otto, responded through Halona's translation. He says he believes you, and he says that tonight we will have a ceremony to bless your union in the Apache way. That evening, as the sun set and stars began to appear in the clear desert sky, the small camp gathered. Kyle stood beside Halona, acutely aware that he was being allowed to witness something rare and sacred. Otto spoke in Apache, his voice carrying across the gathered people. Halona translated quietly for Kyle, though he understood that some things were being said that were not translated. Words meant only for her people. The ceremony involved symbolic gifts. Kyle had little to offer, but he gave Otto his best knife, a tool he had carried since before the war. Otto accepted it gravely, then gave Kyle a woven bracelet that he said had belonged to Halona's grandmother. Kyle placed it on his wrist with reverence. Otto placed Halona's hand in Kyle's and spoke words of blessing over them. Though Kyle did not understand the language, he felt the power of the moment, the weight of tradition and love and hope being woven together. When it was finished, Otto embraced them both. Through Halona, he said, "You are married now in the eyes of my people. Go west as you have planned. Build your life. But remember that you will always have family here, and when it is safe, you must return so we can know you are well." "We will," Halona promised, hugging her father tightly. They stayed with the camp for 3 more days. During that time, Kyle met Halona's siblings, who had all survived the raid and found their way back to Otto. Her brothers were initially suspicious of Kyle, but they warmed to him when they saw how he treated their sister. Her younger sister, hardly more than 15, was simply delighted that Halona was alive and happy. Kyle learned more about Apache customs and history, listened to stories around the fire at night, shared what food and supplies he could spare with the struggling band. He began to understand the depth of the injustice that had been done to these people, the ways they had been pushed from their lands and denied the right to live as they had for generations. On the morning they were to leave, Otto pulled Kyle aside. Speaking through Halona, he said, "The world you and my daughter are going into will not be kind. There will be times when you doubt your choice, when the struggle seems too hard. In those times, remember this: love is the one thing that can bridge any divide. You have proven that by coming here, by opening yourself to my people's traditions, Hold on to that love and it will see you through. I will, Kyle promised. Thank you for trusting me with her. I trust her, Otto corrected. She chose you and she is wise, so I know you must be worthy. They set out again, this time with fresh supplies and directions to settlements Otto knew of where they might find help along the way. Halona was both sad and elated as they rode away from the camp, sad to leave her family again, but elated that she knew they were alive and well. We will see them again, Kyle assured her. When the political situation calms down, when it is safe, we will come back. I know, Halona said, and that knowledge will sustain me. The journey to California took another month. They traveled through Arizona territory and across the Colorado River, always moving west. They encountered few other travelers, which suited them fine. When they did meet people on the trail, they claimed to be cousins traveling together to join family in California. The lie was uncomfortable but necessary. As they drew closer to their destination, Kyle could see Halona becoming more nervous. She was leaving behind everything familiar, heading into a world where she would be even more of an outsider than she had been in New Mexico. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked one evening as they made camp in the foothills of the mountains they would need to cross. "No, never about you, about us. But I am afraid, Kyle, what if we cannot find a place where we fit? What if people refuse to accept us? Then we will keep looking until we find the people who will. They exist, Halona. Not everyone in the world is filled with hate. We will find our place." "How can you be so certain?" "Because I have to be. Because the alternative is giving up before we even start, and I refuse to do that. We have come too far, fought too hard." She smiled at him across the fire. "You are right. I am just tired. Tomorrow I will feel braver." "You are the bravest person I know," Kyle said seriously. "You survived a raid that scattered your family, survived dying in the desert, survived letting me into your heart despite every reason not to trust me. Halona, if you can do all that, you can do anything." They crossed the mountains as October turned to November, and the first time they saw the Pacific Ocean, spread out vast and blue beyond the coastal hills, both of them stopped their horses and simply stared. "I have never seen so much water," Halona breathed. "Me either," Kyle admitted. "It is beautiful." They made their way to San Diego, a growing city where the mix of Mexican, Anglo, and Chinese populations created a somewhat more tolerant atmosphere than they might have found elsewhere. Kyle found work at a livery stable, his skills with horses quickly making him valuable. Halona was more limited in her options, but she found work taking in laundry and doing mending, tasks she could do from the small room they rented. It was not easy. They faced suspicious looks and occasional outright hostility, but they also found allies. The Chinese family who ran the boarding house where they rented their room treated them kindly. An older Mexican woman who ran a market stall befriended Halona and helped her navigate the city. Kyle's employer, a gruff man named Samuel North, did not care what anyone thought as long as Kyle did good work. 3 months after arriving in California, they found a small church where a young priest agreed to marry them in a Christian ceremony. It was important to both of them to have their marriage recognized by law as well as by tradition. The priest asked no difficult questions, simply performed the ceremony with grace. Standing in that small church with Halona beside him, Kyle felt the same sense of rightness he had felt on that desert evening with her father. They were building something lasting, something that would endure whatever challenges came. After the ceremony, they went to the courthouse and registered their marriage. The clerk looked disapproving but could not legally refuse them. Kyle kept the certificate safe, knowing it might one day be important to prove their union was legitimate. As winter gave way to spring, They began to build a real life. Kyle saved money with the goal of eventually buying his own stable. Halona's skill with a needle had attracted the attention of a dressmaker who hired her to do detailed embroidery work, paying far better than laundry ever had. They found a small community of people like themselves, others who had crossed cultural lines to be together or who simply believed in equality and justice. It was not a large group, but it was enough. They had friends, people who visited their small home and shared meals, who celebrated when Halona discovered she was pregnant in the late summer of 1882. Kyle had never imagined he would be a father, had not let himself dream of such things during his years alone. But now, holding Halona at night with his hand on her growing belly, he felt a fierce joy and protectiveness that took his breath away. "We should write to your father," he said one evening. "Tell him about the baby. He should know he is going to be a grandfather." "I have been thinking the same thing," Halona admitted, "but I do not know how to get a letter to him. He moves with the seasons, and I do not know where he would be now." Kyle thought about it. Thomas Mills would know. He seems to keep track of the Apache bands in New Mexico. "I could write to him, ask him to pass along a letter to your father if he gets the chance." "You would do that, of course. He is family now." Kyle wrote the letter that night, carefully explaining where they were and how they were doing, and most importantly, that they were expecting a child in the spring. He sent it care of Mills, along with a note asking the man to forward it if possible. He had no way of knowing if it would ever reach Otto, but the effort mattered. The baby came in April, born during a spring rainstorm that washed the dusty streets clean. Kyle held Halona's hand through the long hours of labor, refusing to leave despite the midwife's insistence that this was women's work. When the baby finally arrived, healthy and squalling, Kyle felt tears stream down his face. A son. They had a son. "What should we name him?" Halona asked, exhausted but radiant as she held the infant. They had discussed names for months, wanting something that honored both their heritages. Finally, they decided on James, an English name that Kyle's brother had carried, and gave him the middle name Otto after Halona's father. James Otto Newman was perfect in every way. He had his mother's dark hair and eyes, his father's nose and chin. Kyle spent hours simply watching him sleep, marveling that he and Halona had created this tiny person. "He is going to grow up in a world that will tell him he does not belong anywhere," Halona said one night as she nursed the baby. "Neither fully white nor fully Apache." "No," Kyle said firmly. "He is going to grow up in a world where he belongs everywhere because he has the best of both his parents in him. We will teach him to be proud of both his heritages. And if the world has a problem with that, the world can go to hell." Halona laughed softly. "You are very fierce for a man who claims to have no stomach for violence." "I will fight with words and actions, not weapons, but I will fight for my family, always." When James was 3 months old, Kyle came home from work one day to find Halona crying over a letter. His heart nearly stopped, fearing bad news, but she looked up at him with a smile through her tears. "My father," she said, waving the letter. "He got our letter," he wrote back. "Kyle, he is so happy about the baby. He says he is proud of us, of the life we are building. He says that next summer, if we can make the journey, he wants to meet his grandson." "Then we will go," Kyle said immediately. "I will save every penny between now and then. We will go back to New Mexico and he will meet James." They did exactly that. Kyle worked extra hours. Halona took on additional sewing projects, and by the following summer, they had enough money to make the journey. James was 15 months old, walking and starting to talk, when they loaded up a wagon and headed east. The reunion was joyful beyond words. Otto held his grandson and wept, speaking in Apache as tears ran down his weathered face. James, fearless as only a toddler can be, grabbed at his grandfather's long hair and laughed. They stayed for 2 weeks, long enough for James to bond with his Apache family, for Otto to teach his grandson a few words in his native language. Kyle and Halona shared stories of their life in California, and Otto shared news of their people. Things were changing, he told them. More Apache were being forced onto reservations, and resistance was becoming harder. But Otto remained cautiously hopeful that eventually there would be justice, that treaties would be honored and his people would be allowed to live in peace. "Your son will see that day," he told Kyle and Halona. "He will live in a better world than we have known. That is what we fight for, even when we cannot see the victory. We fight so our children and grandchildren will have it easier." When it came time to leave, the goodbyes were tearful but not final. They promised to return the next year and the year after that. They would maintain these connections, would make sure James grew up knowing his Apache family. As they headed back west, Halona turned to look back at the desert one last time. "Thank you," she said to Kyle. "For what?" "For making this possible, for loving me enough to bridge two worlds, for giving me a family that includes both my past and my future. You do not need to thank me. This is what love does. It builds bridges where walls used to be. The years that followed were good ones." Kyle eventually saved enough to buy his own small livery stable, which he ran successfully. Halona's embroidery business grew until she was employing other women to help her fulfill orders from the wealthy ladies of San Diego. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Hope, and then another son they named Otto after Halona's father. They made the journey back to New Mexico every summer, maintaining close ties with Halona's Apache family. They watched James grow into a confident young man proud of both his heritages, watched Hope become a fierce advocate for justice, watched little Otto develop his grandfather's wisdom and kindness. They faced prejudice and difficulties, certainly. There were people who refused to do business with them, who made cruel comments, who tried to make their lives harder. But there were also people who supported them, who saw their love and their family and recognized its beauty. Kyle and Halona built a life together that defied the boundaries their world tried to impose. They created a home filled with love and laughter, raised children who understood that heritage was something to be celebrated, not hidden. They showed everyone who knew them that love could indeed bridge any divide. On their 20th wedding anniversary, by which time James was grown and married himself, with his own child on the way, Kyle and Halona sat on the porch of the house they had finally been able to buy, watching the sun set over the Pacific. "You remember that day?" Kyle asked. "When you collapsed at my well, how could I forget? I thought I was going to die. Instead, I found my life." "I was so scared," Kyle admitted. "When I saw you lying there, when I spent those 3 days not knowing if you would wake up, I did not even know you yet, but I knew I could not lose you. You sat beside me the whole time, did you not? The whole 3 days." "I did. I could not leave. Something told me that if I stayed, if I was there when you woke up, everything would be all right." Halona reached over and took his hand, the same way she had that first evening when she had opened her eyes and seen him waiting. "You were right. Everything is all right, better than all right. We have built something beautiful, you and I." "We have," Kyle agreed. "And it all started with a woman collapsing at a well, and a man foolish enough to fall in love with her while she slept." Halona laughed, the sound as bright and joyful as it had been 20 years ago. "Not foolish. Wise. The wisest thing either of us ever did was choose each other." As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared, they sat together in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, hearts forever joined. They had faced the storms and emerged stronger. They had built bridges and torn down walls. They had proven that love, real love, could overcome anything. And in doing so, they had created a legacy that would echo through generations, a testament to the power of choosing compassion over prejudice, love over hate, together over apart. Their grandchildren would tell their children about the Apache woman who collapsed at a well, and the man who stayed beside her for 3 days, waiting for her to wake up. They would tell how that moment of kindness sparked a love that changed everything, that created a family that spanned cultures and defied boundaries. It was a story worth telling, worth preserving, because it was a story about hope, about the possibility of building something better together, no matter what the world says is impossible. And that story, like the love that created it, would endure forever. Years continued to pass, and Kyle and Halona watched their family grow in ways they could never have imagined that desperate day at the well. James, their eldest, became a teacher, dedicating his life to educating children of all backgrounds. He used his unique position, belonging to multiple cultures, to bridge understanding between communities. His wife Maria, a Mexican woman from a prominent family, shared his passion for education and equality. Hope, their daughter, surprised everyone by becoming a lawyer's assistant and eventually studying law herself at a time when few women did so. She specialized in helping people who had been wronged by unjust treaties and discriminatory laws. Her fire and determination reminded Kyle so much of her mother that it made his heart ache with pride. Little Otto, who grew up to be anything but little at well over 6 feet tall, followed in his father's footsteps with horses. But he expanded beyond the livery business, becoming a renowned horse trainer whose skills were sought after throughout California. He married a Chumash woman named Sarah, and together they ran a ranch in the hills outside San Diego. Through all of it, Kyle and Halona remained each other's center. They worked together, supported each other's dreams, weathered every storm as a united front. Their love became legendary in their community, the couple who had defied convention and built something lasting. Halona's father, Otto, lived to see his great-grandchildren, making the journey west to San Diego when he became too frail to remain with his band in New Mexico. He spent his final years living with Kyle and Halona, telling stories to his great-grandchildren about Apache history and culture, ensuring that heritage would never be forgotten. When he passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, both Apache and Anglo friends gathered to honor him. Kyle and Halona buried him in a beautiful spot overlooking the ocean, with Apache rituals combined with Christian blessings. His grave became a place where family gathered, where stories were shared, where the past and present mingled. As Kyle and Halona entered their own elder years, their hair gray and their hands marked by decades of work, they spent more time reflecting on the journey they had taken together. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, much as they had always done, watching the sun set and talking about everything and nothing. "I have been thinking about that day," Halona said one evening when they were both in their 60s. "The day I collapsed at your well. About how close I came to dying before ever knowing you existed." "Divine providence," Kyle said. "It must have been. What else could explain you ending up at my well, of all the places you could have collapsed? My ranch was so isolated. If you had fallen anywhere else, I might never have found you. Or you might have left me there if you had been a different kind of man. Impossible. I saw you lying there, and even before I knew you, something in me recognized you. My soul knew yours, I think." Halona smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Listen to you, the pragmatic rancher, talking about souls recognizing each other. You have made me a romantic in my old age. It is entirely your fault." They laughed together, the sound comfortable and familiar after so many years. A moment later, James arrived with his wife and children for dinner, a weekly tradition that had developed over the years. Soon the house was filled with the sound of children's laughter, with the smell of cooking food, with the warmth of family. Kyle watched his grandchildren playing, saw the easy way they moved between English and Spanish, and the Apache words their grandmother had taught them. He saw how they had been raised to value all parts of their heritage, to see their mixed backgrounds as strengths rather than problems to overcome. This was the world he and Halona had dreamed of creating, he realized. Not a perfect world, certainly. Prejudice and injustice still existed, but they had created a space where love and acceptance thrived, where children grew up learning to build bridges instead of walls. After dinner, as the family gathered in the living room, Hope asked her mother to tell the story. It had become a tradition, this story, requested by different family members at different times but never growing old. "Tell us about the well, Mama," Hope said. "Tell us how you and Papa met." Halona looked at Kyle and he nodded. She had told this story hundreds of times, but it never ceased to move him. "I was running," Halona began, her voice still strong despite her age. "Running from soldiers who had destroyed my camp, scattered my family. I had been running for days with no food and no water through the desert heat. I thought I was going to die. I was ready to die, truth be told. I was so tired, so afraid, so alone." The children, who ranged in age from 5 to 15, listened with rapt attention even though they had heard this story before. "Then I saw it," Halona continued. "A well, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. It was like a mirage, something my mind had created. But I stumbled toward it anyway because what did I have to lose? I remember reaching it, remember trying to grab onto the side to pull myself up, but my body had nothing left to give. And then everything went dark." "That was when Papa found you?" one of the grandchildren asked. "That was when your grandfather found me," Halona confirmed, reaching over to take Kyle's hand. "I was lying in the dust, more dead than alive. He could have left me there. Many men would have, but not your grandfather. I carried her inside," Kyle continued the story. "Cleaned her wounds, gave her water drop by drop, sat beside her bed and prayed she would survive. For 3 days she was unconscious, caught somewhere between life and death. And for 3 days I barely left her side." "Why, Papa?" asked James's youngest daughter. "You did not know her yet." "I cannot fully explain it," Kyle said honestly. "But from the moment I saw her, I felt like I had found something I had been searching for my whole life without knowing I was searching. I could not let her die. I just could not. When I finally woke up," Halona said, "he was there. Sitting beside the bed, waiting. His face was the first thing I saw. I was frightened at first. I did not know where I was or who he was or what would happen to me. But he spoke so gently, looked at me with such kindness that my fear began to fade. And then you fell in love." The youngest grandchild asked dreamily. "And then we fell in love," Kyle confirmed. "Though it took some time. Your grandmother did not trust easily and with good reason. But slowly, day by day, we got to know each other. We talked and shared stories and learned about each other's lives. And somewhere in all that talking and sharing, we realized we did not want to be apart. It was not easy," Halona added, "because it was important for the children to understand this. The world did not want us to be together. We faced anger and prejudice. We had to leave everything behind and start over in a new place, but we had each other and that made it possible. You taught us that love is stronger than hate," Hope said softly. "You taught us that by example every day of our lives." "We tried," Kyle said. "That was all we could do. Try our best to love each other and to teach you to love. to show you that the things that divide people are less important than the things that unite us. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Kyle and Halona lay in bed together. Kyle had his arm around his wife, holding her close the way he had done for more than 40 years. "You have any regrets?" he asked quietly. "Any wishes that things had been different?" "Not a single one," Halona said firmly. "My life with you has exceeded any dream I could have had. Yes, it has been hard sometimes. Yes, we have faced difficulties. But Kyle, you have given me everything that matters. Love, family, a sense of belonging. How could I regret any of it? I feel the same. You saved me, Halona. I did not even realize I needed saving until you collapsed at my well that day. I thought I was content with my solitary life, but I was just existing, not living. You taught me what living really means." "We saved each other," Halona corrected. "You saved my life that day at the well. But I saved yours too in a different way. We were both lost before we found each other. And now we are found. And now we are found." They fell silent, comfortable in each other's arms, listening to the familiar sounds of their house settling around them. Kyle felt a contentment so deep, it was almost physical, a sense of completion that had nothing to do with accomplishment and everything to do with love. The years continued to turn. Kyle and Halona celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The party lasted all day, with friends and family coming from across California, and even from as far as New Mexico, to honor the couple whose love had become a symbol of hope and possibility. 50 years, Kyle marveled as they danced together slowly, their children having cleared space in the middle of the room. "How did we get so old? Speak for yourself," Halona teased. "I am as young as ever." "You are," Kyle said seriously. "To me, you will always be the beautiful woman who woke up in my bed and stole my heart with a single look. Romantic to the end. Always for you." As they danced, Kyle looked around at all the people gathered to celebrate with them. He saw the diversity of his family, the mix of cultures and backgrounds that had become so beautifully intertwined. He saw children who had been raised to value compassion over prejudice, understanding over ignorance. He saw the legacy he and Halona had built together, not in wealth or property, but in love and family. This was what mattered. This was what endured. Kyle died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, with Halona holding his hand. He had lived to see his great-great-grandchildren born, had spent his final years surrounded by the family he and Halona had created. His last words were to his wife. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for waking up. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for this beautiful life." "I will see you again," Halona promised through her tears. "Wait for me, like you waited beside my bed all those years ago. Wait for me and we will be together again. I will wait forever if I have to." Halona lived another 5 years after Kyle's death, years filled with family and memories. She told their story over and over, ensuring that every descendant knew how their family had begun, knew the importance of love and acceptance and courage in the face of adversity. When she finally passed at the age of 76, surrounded by 3 generations of children she and Kyle had created together, her final words echoed his. "I am coming, my love. Thank you for waiting." They buried her next to Kyle on the hill overlooking the ocean, next to her father's grave. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, Apache and Anglo and Mexican and Chinese, all of whom had been touched by the couple's story, by their example of what love could accomplish. On Halona's gravestone beside Kyle's, James had inscribed the words that best captured their story. She collapsed at his well. When she woke 3 days later, he was still there, waiting, and their love changed the world. The legacy of Kyle Newman and Halona Newman lived on through their descendants, through the stories told and retold, through the example they had set. Their great-great-grandchildren would tell their children about the Apache woman who nearly died in the desert, and the man who refused to let her go. They would tell about the love that defied convention, that built bridges across cultures, that proved hope was stronger than hate. And on quiet evenings, when descendants gathered at the house that Kyle had built and Halona had made a home, when they sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the Pacific, they could feel the presence of that love still lingering, could feel the strength of the bond that had started with an act of compassion at a well in the New Mexico territory all those years ago. The well itself, back on the property that had long since passed into other hands, still stood. And occasionally, travelers passing by would stop to drink from it, never knowing that they were touching a piece of history, never knowing that this simple well had been the birthplace of a love story that would echo through generations. But the well knew, the desert knew. And somewhere beyond the veil of death, Kyle and Halona knew too, together again as they had always been meant to be, waiting perhaps for the day when all their descendants would join them and the story could continue in whatever lay beyond. Their story was complete, but its impact would never end. Because love like theirs, love that overcomes every obstacle and builds something beautiful in the face of hatred, that kind of love is eternal. It lives on in every act of kindness, every bridge built between cultures, every person who chooses compassion over prejudice. Kyle and Halona had shown the way. They had proven it was possible, and their descendants, carrying their blood and their legacy, would continue to prove it, generation after generation, until the world finally learned the lesson. Love is stronger than hate. Unity is stronger than division. Hope is stronger than despair. And sometimes, all it takes is one person waiting by a well, refusing to give up, choosing to care. The end.